Title VIII Nursing News. I'm Heather.
And I am Brittany, and we are glad you can join us this evening. As you are aware, we have been doing a nursing series on nursing history. Today we will be remembering the events that occurred in the 1950s that shaped nursing and healthcare today. First, let us set the scene for you. World War II has just ended and nurses have returned home with a new perspective of nursing. The young nurses are now beginning to have children and raising their families, which overloaded the hospital nurseries. By 1953, the birth rate in the United States reached 4 million. These children would later be known as the baby boomers. This created a nursing shortage in the United States. In 1950, the American Hospital Association stated that 22,486 open positions were available for graduate nurses. This is one of the first occurrences of the nurses working a 12-hour shift instead of a typical 8-hour shift.
In the early 50s, polio was starting to become a major problem in the U.S. What started out as a few cases quickly grew into an epidemic that spanned nationwide by 1953. Many nurses came out of World War II and continued traveling, following the epidemic to wherever it was affecting the most people. 1950 brought the reintroduction of the iron lung, a mechanical respirator that allowed people who were paralyzed with polio to breathe. This meant that nurses now had to go through specialized training, which started in 1954, to learn how to care for the patient and the machine. This was often difficult because there was not a lot of information on polio, and nurses were afraid to touch and interact with the patients in fear of contracting it themselves. The Salk vaccine for polio, which was created in 1954, gave hope to nurses working in the clinics. By 1955, the polio vaccine was being given to the public, and polio was virtually eradicated in the country.
The Korean War started June 25, 1950 and lasted until July 27, 1953. At the beginning of the war, the Army and Navy Nurse Corps were low. However, many nurses volunteered, creating a peak of 5,500 Army nurses and 3,238 Navy nurses. Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, also known as MASH, were created and used during this war. Nurses had to adapt to traveling to their patients during the wartime. Along with MASH was an Army helicopter for the critically injured, which created flight nursing. There was one nurse per each plane, sometimes working 72 hours without a break. When the war finally ended, 33,629 Americans were killed, 103,284 were injured, and 5,178 were missing or captured.
In 1952, Hildegard Paplau, known as the mother of psychiatric nursing, published a theory of interpersonal relations. This pioneered a one-on-one relationship between nurses and patients. She created this idea after the time she spent in World War II. In the early 1950s, more than 50% of all patients in the United States hospitals were mentally ill. This allowed for an expansion in psychiatric nursing, including education. The following year, 1953, the formal organization of the National Student Nurses Association of the United States took place at the Nursing Convention in Cleveland. The membership is composed of students of state-accredited professional schools of nursing.
In January of 1951, the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses merged with American Nurses Association. On May 17, 1954, Brown v. Board of Education took place. This allowed 710 African Americans to be admitted into nursing schools, when in 1950 there were only 200. In 1955, Elizabeth Whitford Kemp became the first African American to earn a PhD in nursing. 2 decades later, African Americans were fully integrated into the United States healthcare system. Nurses saw another change when the government responded to Hilton-Burton Act of 1946 by passing the Health Amendments Act of 1956. Title II of this act authorized funds for financial aid to register nurses for full-time study.
In 1958, it was concluded from a research study by Lewis McManus that a 2-year program of study for nursing would prepare registered nurses and become an official college program. During this decade, the public saw this time as the worst decade our nation has ever known. This was because of multiple floods, Hurricane Audrey, the polio epidemic, and the Korean War. Nursing in the 1950s was still seen as women's work, and nurses were sexualized through public advertisements. However, there were many great advancements in nursing that came from this era. And that will conclude tonight's report on nursing in the 1950s.
And don't forget to tune in for next week's episode. Thanks for joining us.